Alrighty, welcome to this episode of Lectures with Liddington. Today we're going to talk about the first of those macromolecules or the biomolecules, and that is carbohydrates or carbs. Means the same thing. I'm sure you've heard this term a lot because it's in our food. Well, our food is where we get those macromolecules. It's where we get what we need. So carbs specifically, their function is energy, and it's short-term, quick access energy. It can be stored in different sections of the body, or it can be used really quickly. Think about things like, oh, I had a sugar rush, right? So you're quickly accessing those carbohydrates, the energy in them, or it can get stored. Some organisms, especially plants, and some animals as well, will also use different types of carbohydrates for structural components within those organisms. But we'll talk about that more as we go. So we talked about some vocabulary words when we talked about macromolecules, and those were monomers and polymers. Remember, mono means one, so monomers are the bits and pieces that make up the polymer. Well, specifically when we're talking about carbohydrates, that monomer is called a monosaccharide. Mono meaning one and saccharide meaning sugar. Our carbohydrates are very simple in the sense that they are composed of only three elements. CHO, or CHO is a little way to remember it. And that's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Those are those three elements. So that's all you're seeing. So if you're looking at a structure, especially if it's a ring, notice we've got a bunch of rings here. If we're looking at rings, we're looking at a carbohydrate. Some examples, glucose. Glucose is going to be one of the most common monosaccharides that there are. It is the main product of photosynthesis, so we're going to see it come into play a lot as we go along. Fructose is another very common monosaccharide that we talk about. It's in fruit. You'll find lots of fructose in fruit. Kind of makes sense. And then galactose is another one that we find. For example, that one's in milk. So there actually is sugar in milk, which might sound kind of weird, but there are milk sugars, and galactose is one of them. So when we talk about carbohydrates, there's another sort of level of organization. There are monosaccharides, but there are also disaccharides, and di means two. So a disaccharide is two sugars. And this is when we take two monosaccharides and put them together. So if we look over here, oh, we've got a reaction. Here's our monosaccharide. Here's another monosaccharide. And now there are two together, so I have a disaccharide. What kind of reaction is this? You're right. Dehydration synthesis. We're removing the water and we are synthesizing, in this case, maltose. Another vocabulary word here is simple sugars. Mono and disaccharides together, we refer to them as simple sugars because they are much smaller physically than the other ones, the other carbohydrates that we can make. They're called complex carbs. We'll talk about those in a bit. But simple sugars, your mono and disaccharides, are much smaller. These are going to interact in your body much differently than the other larger types. So some common examples of disaccharides include maltose, sucrose, and lactose. Maltose is like if you have a malted milkshake, it's the sugar that you would find in that. We take a glucose and another glucose, and we combine those together. Glucose we're going to see a lot as we go forward. So look at that 6-carbon carbohydrate ring, You're going to want to know what that one is, but we'll see it again later. Sucrose is another super common disaccharide. This is Sugar, good old-fashioned regular table sugar. You put it in your coffee, sucrose. Sucrose is a disaccharide. It's glucose and fructose put together. And then lactose, this is another important sugar. It's a disaccharide. It is a combination of a galactose and a glucose. And what's going on here is that lactose is the sugar in milk. So when we start to talk about enzymes, we'll talk about lactose and lactose intolerance and how that all ties back to things. So just take a look, and that's what a lactose looks like. It is a disaccharide, but we'll touch back to that again. So when we talk about carbohydrates, our polymer is a polysaccharide, right? Poly meaning many, so many sugars. It makes sense, right? You put lots of monosaccharides together and we get a polysaccharide. Another term that we use for these is complex carbohydrates. These are much larger, so it's going to take longer for your body to break them down because you have all those pieces. Ultimately, you need them into the little teeny pieces in order to get them into your cells, so it's going to take longer. This is why they kind of stay with you a little bit better when you eat complex carbohydrates. So things like breads, pastas, for example, those would be complex carbohydrates. Some other common examples in living things, starches, right? So starches are an example of a complex carbohydrate, a polysaccharide. Remember, I was just saying bread, pasta, right? Starches. Those are large carbohydrate molecules. Glycogen is another very large polysaccharide that animals use as an energy storage device. And then cellulose is another real important polysaccharide, and it is involved in plant structures. So a lot of times it's there to provide support and structure for plants. They don't have like a spine to make them stand up, so they have adapted to cellulose as their structure that they use for that. All right, so let's move on and try a little bit of practice.